You ever look at some of the conflicts around the world and just wonder, why don't they ever seem to end? Generation after generation gets pulled into the same fight, long after the original reasons feel like ancient history. Well, it's a tragic cycle for sure, and today we're going to unpack the psychological and political engine that drives these forever wars. It's a machine built from fear, memory, and identity. So what's the deal? Why do they last so long? The answer isn't just about things like land or resources. It's about something much, much deeper. It's a dangerous chain reaction that starts with a single, powerful idea, and it can end with a society so wrapped up in conflict, it can't even imagine a world without it.
All right, so to really get this, we're going to follow a four-step chain reaction. We'll start with the spark that ignites the whole thing. Then we'll look at the fuel that keeps it burning. After that, we'll see how the fire forges a whole new identity for a society. And finally, we'll trace the fallout that locks the conflict in for generations to come.
Okay, so it all starts with the spark. And this isn't a missile or a bomb we're talking about. It's an idea. The idea of an existential threat. So what exactly is an existential threat? Well, on the surface, it's simple. A threat so big it could completely wipe something out of existence. But here's the kicker. The word you really need to focus on is perceived. An existential threat doesn't actually have to be real. A society just has to be convinced that it is, that their entire way of life is about to be extinguished.
This slide is pretty cool because it helps you visualize the whole spectrum of threats. Down here in the bottom left, you have personal stuff that you can endure, like a car getting stolen. It stinks, but you'll get over it. But way up here in the top right, that's the red zone. That's global terminal risk. We're talking civilization-ending stuff. So when a leader frames a political problem as belonging in that terrifying red box, it triggers a primal survival-based response in all of us, and rational debate just goes right out the window.
And that framing is just incredibly powerful because, as this quote shows, it bypasses our logical brains entirely and hits us right in the gut. It taps into our deepest, most primal fear. The fear of being annihilated. Not just you, but your family, your culture, your entire people, just wiped off the map.
So you have to understand, calling something an existential threat is almost never just a neutral description. It's often a manipulative trope. It's a political tool, a way to create panic and urgency. And it's the perfect tool for bypassing all the normal legal and democratic rules, setting the stage for a permanent state of emergency.
So we have the spark of fear. But how does that spark get fanned into the political fuel you need for a long-term war? Well, the answer lies in a process called securitization.
Securitization is basically the instruction manual for weaponizing fear. Think of it like this. A political leader can take any normal issue, like immigration or economic competition, and they can reframe it as a crisis of national survival. And as soon as they do that, they can argue that the normal rules of politics just don't apply anymore.
And it works in three pretty clear steps. First, you have the speech act. A leader gets up and declares, this is an existential threat. Second, and this is absolutely critical, an audience has to buy it. They have to be convinced. And third, once that threat is accepted, the door is wide open for emergency measures. We're talking about war, mass surveillance, suspending civil liberties, all done without the usual democratic debate, creating a society that's basically living in a permanent state of crisis.
And what this chart shows so clearly is just how flexible this political tool is. A threat can be cooked up in almost any part of life. It could be a military threat to your borders, a political threat to your government, or even a societal threat to your very identity as a people. This process can turn almost any policy debate into a life or death struggle.
So the fuel has been added to the fire. But what happens to a society when it's forced to live in this constant state of emergency, year after year after year? This is where the fire of collective trauma really starts to reshape a nation's soul.
This quote from Kai Erikson just hits the nail on the head. We're not just talking about a collection of individuals who are anxious or scared. Collective trauma is a deep wound to the social fabric itself. It shreds the bonds of trust that hold a community together.
And this is where it becomes what we call transgenerational trauma. It creates a massive crisis of meaning, where the old ways of understanding the world just don't make sense anymore. The trauma itself becomes the new lens that people use to see everything, their past, their present, and their future.
And out of this crisis of meaning comes this deep, deep need for something called ontological security. Now, it's a kind of fancy term, but it's a crucial concept if you want to understand forever wars. Just like a person, a state needs a stable sense of who it is, its identity, its story.
And a lot of the time, this need to have a coherent identity can become even more powerful than the need for simple physical safety. This leads to what you could call a memory war. For victim groups, remembering the trauma is absolutely essential. It's the core of their identity and their meaning. But for the group seen as the perpetrators, that very same memory is a threat to their own positive self-image. So you get this impossible situation where one group's identity is built on remembering the very thing the other group is desperate to forget.
Okay, now we can connect all these pieces and see the final devastating fallout. How exactly does this fire of trauma forge a conflict that can burn for generations?
Through this shared trauma, the group's idea of itself completely changes. It stops being just a collection of living people. Instead, it becomes what social scientists call a transgenerational entity. The group no longer sees itself as just the people living now. It sees itself as a single, continuous being stretching from its most ancient ancestors all the way to its unborn descendants. An attack today is felt as an attack on the past and the future.
And this slide shows the really terrifying consequence of that shift in thinking. If the group itself is seen as immortal, and the lives of individual people in the here and now, well, they can start to seem secondary. A sacrifice in the present is just seen as a necessary price to pay for the symbolic immortality of the entire group.
And this leads us to the central, tragic paradox of the Forever War. The conflict itself becomes the main source of the group's stable identity, their ontological security. The rivalry gives them a clear sense of us versus them, a purpose, a story. And in this mindset, peace isn't a relief. It's a terrifying void. It's an identity crisis that feels more dangerous than the war itself.
So let's just walk through that entire chain reaction one more time. It starts when a leader declares an existential threat. This securitizes the issue, giving them emergency powers to wage a long-term conflict. That conflict creates deep collective trauma. And that trauma forges a new transgenerational identity, where the war itself becomes essential to the group's sense of who they are, creating a tragic, self-perpetuating cycle.
This is the engine of a generational conflict. It's a cold war of identity that can simmer for a century, because it leaves us with one really difficult question. If the fight is what gives your nation its meaning, if the enemy is what tells you who you are, how do you ever bring yourself to stop fighting?